When Link traverses through some of the most dangerous and inhospitable places found in Hyrule, he often needs special armor sets to even survive. One set that keeps on coming back and has been seen in quite a lot of Zelda titles is the Zora Armor. But I always wondered, how is it made and how does it work? With it, Link can swim much faster and can even stay underwater forever. So how is that possible? Well, the answer might be a lot darker than anyone would ever imagine. Now, the first time we ever saw the full Zora Armor set was in Ocarina of Time, but in A Link to the Past you could already see that Nintendo was experimenting with the idea. Because in that game you could obtain the Zora flippers, which allowed you to dive and travel between whirlpools. However, in Ocarina of Time we finally get the full set, which allows you to breathe underwater, and from that point onward it became a bit of a staple in the 3D titles. In almost every game that the Zoras are seen in, Link is able to get his hands on a set of Zora armor to either dive forever, get around a lot easier, or even swim up waterfalls with tremendous speed. Now in Ocarina of Time it seems like these armor sets are almost mass produced, because you can just buy one in a store, and they are not even that expensive, being only 300 rupees, while a normal red potion is worth 30. According to the Nintendo Player's Guide, a group of Hylians even received a set of armor from the king to help purify the water that's coming from Zora's domain. It says that the Hylian water inspectors often needed to cleanse the riverbed of pollutants, and to help them breathe underwater, the Zoras outfitted the Hylians with a suit of fish gills. It could even be that this armor was invented specifically for this, and later on they found a lot of new use cases. But in Twilight Princess, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, this armor set is a lot more rare, with one being constructed by the former king of the Zoras, which Link has to retrieve from his grave, and the other being made by the former princess of the Zoras, Mipha, as a symbol of love for Link. So for some reason Zora armor became a lot more rare down the road. But obviously the big question we are trying to answer here is, what is it made of, and how does it transfer the powers of a fish onto a normal Hylian? Well, a hot second ago I already mentioned that this suit is made of gills, so I think that's a good place to start. Now, if you look across all of the Zelda games, you will notice that fish gills aren't really an item you can obtain or something. So that might have been a communication error or mistranslation. Some even consider the Nintendo player guides as not canon. Many are written by third-party companies after all, so I always take them with a grain of salt. Now, there are other items tied to the Zoras that can give you similar powers, which are incorporated into later sets, because in many ways, these fish are quite unique. The Zoras are a gifted race that are almost one with the water, and these beautiful creatures have a number of superpowers. They excel at swimming, can live on both land and underwater, and can apparently throw their fins like a boomerang, as well as exude magical energy. And in game we can actually harness their energy, their powers, in multiple ways, aside from literally becoming one in Majora's Mask. In many games, having just a single scale of a Zora can already greatly enhance Link's abilities underwater. In Ocarina of Time, Link's own abilities allow him to dive for no more than 3 seconds, but as soon as he has a silver scale, it is doubled, which clearly shows us that the powers of the Zora are locked in there. And anyone who even has one benefits from their power, although you can only get one of their many talents. But not all Zora skills are made the same. Some are much stronger than others, because Link can also obtain the golden scale, allowing him to dive even further than with the silver variant. However, how these skills actually work is a bit vague. It could be some kind of magical gift bestowed upon the Zoras that any holders just benefit from. That would fit best with how they actually work in-game. And there is some proof for this in the Nintendo Player Guide for Ocarina of Time. In this book you can find an excerpt that states, "When the goddess created Hyrule, they blessed Zora's fountain. For ages fish swam in the sacred water before evolving into people known as Zoras." So these normal fish evolved and became imbued with magic due to Zora's domain, which is something we even kind of see in Skyward Sword. The Perella later on evolved into the Zoras. However, you could also say that it's a natural thing. I mean, Zoras are most likely able to breathe underwater because they have gills like any other fish. So why would these skills give you powers? Well, magic. That makes the most sense. And so the Zoras, in collaboration with the Hylians, took it a step further, creating a whole suit out of scales. In every Zelda title, that's the main component of the armor, even if it doesn't look like that. Pushing the powers of a Zora scale to the max, allowing the wearer to stay underwater indefinitely. Well, except for in the two recent Nintendo Switch titles, where the set gives you completely different powers. However, we will get back to that later, because there's clearly something different about those sets compared to all the others. Now, while there are many benefits to using this armor set, there are also downsides in some of the Zelda titles. In Twilight Princess, the armor makes you incredibly vulnerable to fire and ice attacks, something the Zora are clearly not able to withstand. So you get the good and the bad. Now at this point, it is clear that the Zora armor is made from hundreds of Zora scales, in at least some of the games. And these scales radiate some sort of magical power that the wearer can benefit from. But why did the Zora stop making them? In the game set after Ocarina of Time, Zora armor is incredibly rare. Well, it could be that there's a very dark reason why they stopped making more. While Zora scales seem plentiful in Ocarina of Time, with most of them being quite easy to obtain, there's a good chance that this is actually a rare material. In basically all fish, scales primarily act as a natural armor and reduce friction when swimming around. In many ways, it's like a suit of chainmail. They protect the soft-bodied fish from predators, harsh conditions, and even parasites. Simultaneously, their overlapping pattern allows for flexible movement while reducing drag in the water. So really, the Zoras need their scales. Most fish in the real world keep them for life, and they grow with them as they age. Now, some do have a tactic of dropping scales to escape from predators, but aside from that, fish only lose scales when harmed. So maybe Zoras do shed their scales, and if that's the case, then they must be plentiful, with different levels of quality depending on the individual and their age. However, there's also a good chance that this is not how it works, making scales much more valuable, which actually fits a lot better with what we see later on in the Zelda games. So why are they so plentiful in Ocarina of Time? Well, before the events of Ocarina of Time, Hyrule went through a horrifying event known as the Hyrulean Civil War. Little is known about this event, except for the fact that it lasted an incredibly long time, claimed an immense amount of lives, and ended with the unification of the world under one banner, the Hylian banner. Now, during such a conflict, Zora's domain, the water source for much of Hyrule, is certainly a crucial point to fight over. So I assume that the Zoras also had their fair share of casualties during this conflict. And even though it's a bit dark, the skills of their fallen brethren are very useful. And so during as well as after this conflict, getting your hands on Zora scales or even a full set of armor was a lot easier than you would expect. So the set you end up buying in Ocarina of Time is most likely made out of Zora scales of fallen warriors that died during the Civil War. Now, as time went on, these armor sets and scales either eroded over time due to use or were lost somehow, making them a rare commodity again. At that point, only if a Zora dies of old age or either due to wounds, they can get new ones. But I assume that many Zoras wouldn't want their deceased relatives to be used for their resources. This is why the Zora armor is much more rare in a lot of the games set after Ocarina of Time. They aren't available in stores anymore. Instead, they can only be obtained from the Zora royal family. The sets seen in Twilight Princess and the Switch titles were made by either the king or princess, not just some random craftsman. But it could also be that the art of making one of these sets became lost over time, with only a select few knowing how to construct one. This could even explain why they became so rare, even if no Zora scales were needed, and the armor is actually made from random fish gills. I can imagine that making such a set requires a high level of knowledge, and maybe even magical powers. Now, in 2 of the Zelda timelines, Zora Armor sets even completely disappeared. In the adult timeline, it makes sense, because they transformed into Rito, even though the entire world became a massive ocean. But that's a topic we might look into another time. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Zoras and Hylians is much more shaky in the Downfall timeline, which might be the reason why it's not seen there. Or, like I said before, the art of making one was lost, which makes sense with this timeline because awful events happen. Ganondorf wins after all. But in some games they made some changes to the armor, using different materials than before, which might actually explain why the powers of the Zora Armor set in the Switch titles is very different from those seen in Ocarina of Time. During the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, we can see that the Zoras survived all their trials and tribulations throughout the centuries. They are doing well, haven't turned into birds for some reason, and are still loyal members of the Kingdom of Hyrule. It seems like they are very well off, with Zora's domain being an impressive feat of architecture, masonry, and engineering. However, while it might seem that they are at the height of their power, the Zora Armor lost one of its main features, while gaining a number of new ones. The set's abilities are completely different this time around. You can swim up waterfalls, spin underwater, and swim faster. While only one set can be found, we find out that this armor incorporates a lot more materials than any of the older sets, which were mostly made out of Zora scales. In Tears of the Kingdom, we need to restore the chest piece of the set, and while it is mostly complete, the last thing needed to repair it is the scale of an ancient arowana, a type of fish that wasn't seen in Hyrule for a long time, until the upheaval happened at the beginning of the game. This already shows us that as time went on, other materials were used more and more often, and some of these became scarce, just like the Zora scales. However, this isn't the only new material that's used in the Zora armor. When you collect the other pieces, the description all of a sudden states, it is said they are crafted using dragon scales. Now that is completely new. Both of these materials that are now incorporated into the armor were never seen or even mentioned in any of the older games. But this could explain why in the modern titles the Zora armor lost the ability of underwater breathing, while it gained a bunch of new powers. It is clear to me that the modern Zora armor doesn't really use Zora scales like it did in the past, and so breathing underwater isn't possible anymore. But by using scales of other powerful creatures like dragons and ancient fish, they were able to give the wearer new powers. Especially the scales from a dragon like Nadra could be a perfect fit, because the magical energy radiating off this creature is even more intense than that of a Zora, and this dragon can also be found close by. Many armor sets are crafted using dragon parts, or they are needed to upgrade them. So it's clear that the way they construct this armor changed over the centuries, leading to the loss of some powers, while it gained a bunch of new ones. It could be due to the scarcity of Zora scales, a lack of knowledge how to incorporate them into an armor set, the loss of other certain materials, or the fact that the Zoras might not like the idea of someone wearing their dead relatives. So some things will remain a mystery. The world of Zelda changes a lot after all, and Nintendo barely ever explains why. However, this isn't the only topic we tackled. For example, who's trapped in a mirror shield? How often was the full Triforce used and for what? And what exactly happened to the Ocarina of Time? Well, check out those videos right now. Aside from that, I stream here on YouTube every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And don't forget, be sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss any future videos.